The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, reviewing the day's schedule with his private secretary. The familiar routine of royal duties stretched ahead of him, but something felt different today. There was an unusual tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Camilla, now queen consort, moved gracefully through the corridors of their residence, her mind occupied with thoughts that had been troubling her for weeks. She had always prided herself on being a supportive partner to Charles, understanding the delicate balance required in their unique position. However, recent developments had stirred emotions she thought she had long since buried. The source of her unease was Princess Anne, Charles's beloved sister, who had requested a private audience with the king, and had been a pillar of strength for the royal family throughout decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges. Her unwavering dedication to duty and her no-nonsense approach to royal responsibilities had earned her respect both within the family and among the British public. But Camilla saw something different in Anne's recent behavior. There had been subtle changes, small gestures, and comments that suggested the princess royal harbored reservations about certain aspects of the new reign. These observations had planted seeds of doubt in Camilla's mind, growing into a gnawing concern that and might influence Charles in ways that could undermine the stability they had worked so hard to achieve. The relationship between Camilla and had always been complex. While they maintained a cordial public facade, there existed an underlying tension that both women navigated with practiced diplomacy and represented the old guard, the traditional values, and unwavering commitment to duty that had defined the royal family for generations. Camilla, despite her years of service and gradual acceptance by the public, still felt the weight of being an outsider who had married into this ancient institution. As Charles prepared for what he believed would be a routine meeting with his sister, Camilla found herself wrestling with a decision that went against every instinct of propriety and family loyalty she possessed. The thought of interfering with the relationship between the siblings felt wrong, yet her protective instincts toward Charles and their shared future compelled her to act. The king's study was filled with the soft ticking of an antique clock, a gift from his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The familiar sound usually brought him comfort, reminding him of the continuity and tradition he now embodied. Today, however, it seemed to mark time with an urgency that made him restless. Charles had always shared a special bond with Anne. Despite the 4-year age gap between them, they had grown up as allies in a world where their every move was scrutinized and their personal desires often sacrificed for duty. In straightforward manner and fierce independence had been a source of strength for Charles during his own struggles with public perception and personal relationships. The Princess Royal had weathered her own storms over the years, from her divorce from Mark Phillips to her remarriage to Timothy Lawrence, all while maintaining an exhaustive schedule of royal engagements. Her dedication to her charitable work and her role as one of the hardest working members of the royal family had never wavered, even during the most challenging periods. Now, as Charles settled into his role as monarch, he valued Anne's counsel more than ever. Her perspective, shaped by decades of royal service and an intimate understanding of the institution's strengths and vulnerabilities, was invaluable to him as he navigated the complex challenges of modern monarchy. Camilla's office, elegantly appointed with personal touches that reflected her love of literature and interior design, had become her sanctuary within the formal structure of royal residences. Here, surrounded by books and photographs that told the story of her journey from private citizen to queen consort, she contemplated the action she was about to take. The decision had not come easily. For weeks, she had observed the subtle dynamics at play during family gatherings and official functions. She noticed how Anne's comments, though never openly critical, carried undertones that suggested concern about the direction of the monarchy under Charles's leadership. There were references to maintaining standards and preserving tradition that seemed pointed, though never explicitly stated. More troubling to Camilla were the private conversations she had overheard between Charles and Anne. The siblings spoke with the easy familiarity of a lifetime shared, but Camilla detected notes of doubt in Charles's voice after these exchanges. She saw how Anne's concerns, however well-intentioned, sometimes left Charles questioning decisions he had made with confidence. The queen consort understood that her perspective might be colored by her own insecurities and the lingering effects of years spent as a controversial figure in the public eye. She had worked tirelessly to earn acceptance and respect, transforming from the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage to a valued member of the royal family. The journey had been long and often painful, requiring a strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. But now, as she watched Charles begin to establish his reign, she felt a fierce protectiveness that overrode her usual diplomatic instincts. She had seen him doubt himself too often, had witnessed the toll that criticism and uncertainty took on his naturally sensitive nature. If there was a possibility that Anne's influence might contribute to that uncertainty, Camilla felt compelled to act, even if it meant crossing lines she had never imagined crossing. The morning of Anne's planned visit arrived with typical British weather, overcast skies that threatened rain, but held back their promise. Charles had risen early, as was his custom, spending time in his garden before the demands of the day took precedence. The physical connection to the earth and growing things had always been a source of peace for him, a way to ground himself in something real and lasting beyond the artificial constructs of royal protocol. As he worked among his beloved plants, Charles reflected on the conversation he would have with his sister, and had been cryptic in her request for the meeting, mentioning only that there were family matters that required discussion. Her tone had carried a seriousness that concerned him, though he attributed it to the natural weight of their new circumstances as monarch and princess royal. The relationship between the royal siblings had evolved over the years, shaped by shared experiences and mutual respect, and had been one of Charles's strongest supporters during the difficult years following Diana's death, when public opinion had turned sharply against him. Her loyalty during that dark period had meant everything to him, providing a stability that helped him rebuild his public image and personal confidence. Now, as king, Charles relied on Anne's judgment and her deep understanding of royal duty. She represented a continuity with their mother's reign that was invaluable during this period of transition. Her approval of his decisions and direction carried weight not just within the family, but throughout the broader royal household and the institutions that supported the monarchy. Camilla's morning routine was disrupted by the weight of the decision she had made. Instead of her usual breakfast with Charles, she found herself making phone calls from her private office, speaking in hushed tones with palace staff who were bound by loyalty and discretion. The conversations were careful and coded, but their purpose was clear. Princess Anne's visit would not take place as scheduled. The mechanics of the intervention were delicate and required careful coordination. A sudden illness in Anne's household, a scheduling conflict that had been overlooked, urgent matters requiring the Princess Royal's immediate attention elsewhere. These were the explanations that would be offered. The cancellation would appear natural and unavoidable, with no hint of the orchestrated effort behind it. As Camilla made these arrangements, she felt a mixture of guilt and determination. She told herself that she was protecting Charles, that sometimes those who love us most must make difficult decisions on our behalf. But even as she justified her actions, she knew that what she was doing would be seen as a betrayal by both Charles and if they ever discovered the truth. The palace staff who assisted in the deception did so with professional discretion, though some harbored private reservations about the unprecedented nature of the request. The queen consort's position gave her the authority to make such arrangements, but the implications of blocking a meeting between the king and his sister went far beyond typical protocol adjustments. By midday, the elaborate fiction was in place. Anne's office had been contacted with news of the unavoidable scheduling conflict that would require postponing the meeting. Alternative dates were suggested, though Camilla had ensured that these would face similar mysterious obstacles. The goal was not to prevent the siblings from meeting indefinitely, but to buy time for what she hoped would be a cooling of whatever tensions had prompted Anne's original request. Charles received the news of the postponement with disappointment, but understanding acceptance. Royal schedules were notoriously complex, and last-minute changes were an unfortunate reality of their positions. He instructed his private secretary to find alternative arrangements as soon as possible, emphasizing his desire to meet with and at the earliest opportunity. The king spent the afternoon that had been set aside for his sister's visit attending to other matters, and remained on his mind. There was something in her recent demeanor that concerned him, a tension that seemed to go beyond the normal adjustments required by his accession to the throne. He wondered if she was struggling with aspects of the transition that she felt unable to discuss openly, and, for her part, was frustrated by the postponement, but accepted it with characteristic stoicism. The matter she wished to discuss with Charles felt urgent to her, touching on concerns about the monarchy's direction that she believed required immediate attention. The delay meant that these issues would continue to weigh on her mind, potentially growing in significance as time passed. The Princess Royal had always been direct in her communication, preferring honest conversation to diplomatic evasion. This approach had served her well throughout her royal career, earning her a reputation for authenticity that was rare in their rarefied world. The subjects she wanted to raise with Charles required this directness, as they touched on fundamental questions about tradition, change, and the future of the institution they both served. As the day progressed, Camilla found herself second-guessing her decision while simultaneously reinforcing her resolve. She observed Charles as he went about his duties, noting his occasional glances toward his phone as if expecting a call from or his private secretary with news of a rescheduled meeting. His disappointment was subtle, but evident to someone who knew him as intimately as she did. The Queen Consort's love for Charles was profound and genuine, shaped by decades of shared experience and mutual support through public criticism and personal challenges. This love was what drove her to take such unprecedented action, even as it caused her considerable emotional distress. She told herself that protecting someone you love sometimes requires difficult choices, even when those choices feel wrong in the moment. Evening arrived with no resolution to the scheduling conflict, much to Charles's growing concern. He made several attempts to reach and directly, but found himself consistently directed to her private secretary, who expressed regret about the continuing complications with the Princess Royal schedule. The unusual nature of these delays began to register with Charles, though he had no reason to suspect deliberate interference. The king's unease grew as he realized how much he had been looking forward to the conversation with his sister. Anne's perspective had always been valuable to him, her insights shaped by a lifetime of royal service and an understanding of their unique challenges that few others could provide. The postponement felt like more than just an inconvenience. It represented a missed opportunity for connection and guidance during a critical period of his reign. Camilla watched Charles's frustration with a mixture of sympathy and guilt. She wanted to comfort him, to explain that the delay was temporary and that the meeting would eventually take place under circumstances she hoped would be less fraught with potential complications. But the nature of her intervention made such comfort impossible without revealing her role in the situation. As they prepared for bed that evening, Charles spoke to Camilla about his concern for her and, wondering aloud if something was troubling his sister beyond the usual pressures of royal life. His genuine care for Anne's well-being made Camilla's deception feel even more painful, though it also reinforced her belief that she was protecting a relationship that meant a great deal to both siblings. The conversation between Charles and Camilla that night was filled with the unspoken tensions that had been building throughout the day. Charles expressed his frustration with the scheduling difficulties and his desire to support and through whatever challenges she might be facing. Camilla listened with careful attention, offering comfort while carefully avoiding any suggestion that she might have insight into the situation that Charles lacked. Sleep came restlessly for both of them that night, though for very different reasons. Charles was troubled by a growing sense that something was amiss, a feeling he couldn't articulate but couldn't shake. Camilla was tormented by the knowledge of what she had done and the potential consequences if her intervention was discovered. The foundation of trust that had sustained their relationship through so many challenges now felt fragile beneath the weight of her deception. The following morning brought new complications as Anne's office continued to report scheduling difficulties that prevented the rescheduling of the meeting. Charles's private secretary began to express his own confusion about the unusual nature of these conflicts, noting that they seemed to arise with suspicious regularity whenever alternative dates were proposed. As the pattern became more apparent, Charles began to feel the first stirrings of suspicion that something beyond ordinary scheduling conflicts was at play. His natural trust in the systems and people around him warred with a growing sense that he was being deliberately kept from meeting with his sister. The possibility that someone might be interfering with his personal and professional relationships was so foreign to his experience that he initially dismissed it as paranoid thinking. But as the day wore on and the obstacles to meeting with and continued to multiply, Charles could no longer ignore the possibility that these delays were not coincidental. The king, who had spent his entire life navigating the subtle currents of royal politics and personal relationships, began to apply that experience to his current situation, and what he discovered filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with affairs of state. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge not only the relationship between Charles and Camilla, but the very foundations of trust and loyalty upon which the modern royal family had been built. The truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of that day's events would soon emerge, bringing with it consequences that none of them had fully anticipated. The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by Charles's private secretary in the hushed tones reserved for the most sensitive of royal matters. Sir Edmund Worthington had served the royal family for over 2 decades, his discretion and loyalty beyond question. But even his considerable diplomatic skills were tested by the delicate nature of what he had discovered. Charles was in his study, reviewing correspondence from Commonwealth leaders, when Sir Edmund requested a private audience. The formal nature of the request was unusual enough to catch the king's attention immediately. In their daily interactions, protocol was relaxed, with Sir Edmund typically entering with updates and briefings delivered in the comfortable manner of long professional association. The private secretary's discomfort was evident as he closed the study door behind him with unusual care. His normally composed demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty that Charles had rarely witnessed. Sir Edmund had weathered royal scandals, navigating crisis communications, and managing delicate family situations with unflappable professionalism. This visible anxiety was unprecedented and deeply concerning. Charles set aside his papers and gave Sir Edmund his full attention, sensing that whatever had prompted this formal request would be significant. The king had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when routine royal business had given way to matters of genuine consequence. The careful preparation of his private secretary's approach suggested news that would require his immediate and serious consideration. Sir Edmund began with the careful phrasing that marked sensitive revelations within the royal household. He spoke of irregularities in scheduling procedures and unusual interventions in standard protocol. The language was deliberately vague, but Charles understood immediately that something had gone seriously wrong with the normal operations of his household. The explanation that followed was delivered with the precise detail that Sir Edmund brought to all his duties, but his usual confidence was replaced by obvious reluctance. He had spent considerable time verifying his information before bringing it to the king, understanding that accusations of this nature required absolute certainty and meticulous documentation. Princess and had indeed attempted to schedule multiple meetings with her brother, each request processed through normal channels and confirmed by both households. However, each confirmation had been followed by unexpected cancellations initiated from within Charles's own staff structure. The cancellations bore the authorization codes that indicated they had come from the highest levels of the household hierarchy. Charles listened with growing bewilderment as Sir Edmund detailed the paper trail that had led him to this discovery. The private secretary had initially attributed the scheduling conflicts to the complex logistics of royal calendars, but persistent patterns had drawn his attention. When Anne's office had expressed frustration about the repeated delays, he had begun a discreet investigation into the administrative processes involved. What Sir Edmund had uncovered was a systematic pattern of interference that could only have originated from someone with both access to sensitive scheduling information and the authority to override standard procedures. The technical aspects of how the cancellations had been arranged pointed to someone within Charles's immediate household, someone trusted with the most confidential aspects of his daily life. The king's initial reaction was disbelief. The idea that someone in his inner circle would deliberately sabotage his relationship with and seemed impossible. Charles had surrounded himself with staff whose loyalty and discretion had been proven over years of service. The suggestion that one of these trusted individuals would engage in such deception challenged his fundamental understanding of the relationships that sustained his daily life. But Sir Edmund's evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. He had traced each cancellation to its source, following authorization codes and documentation that created an irrefutable record of deliberate interference. The pattern was too consistent and too sophisticated to be explained by administrative error or misunderstanding. As the reality of the situation began to penetrate Charles's shock, his mind turned immediately to the question of who could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The number of people with the necessary access and authority was limited, making the investigation both easier and more troubling. Each possibility represented a profound betrayal of trust by someone he had considered completely reliable. Sir Edmund hesitated before revealing the final piece of his investigation, understanding that this information would be the most difficult for Charles to accept. The authorization codes and procedural patterns all pointed to interventions that had originated from the Queen Consort's office. The evidence suggested that Camilla herself had orchestrated the systematic blocking of Anne's attempts to meet with her brother. The silence that followed this revelation stretched uncomfortably as Charles struggled to process information that seemed to contradict everything he believed about his wife. Camilla had been his partner through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenge. Her support had been unwavering, her loyalty absolute. The suggestion that she would deliberately interfere with his family relationships was so foreign to his experience that he initially sought alternative explanations. Charles questioned Sir Edmund extensively, hoping to find flaws in the investigation or alternative interpretations of the evidence. But the private secretary's thoroughness had anticipated these concerns, and he had documentation to support every aspect of his findings. The trail of authorization codes, the timing of the cancellations, and the sophisticated nature of the cover stories all pointed to careful planning and execution by someone with intimate knowledge of royal procedures. The king's shock began to give way to a deeper, more troubling emotion as the implications of Sir Edmund's discovery became clear. If Camilla had indeed interfered with his relationship with Anne, it represented not just a betrayal of trust, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the values and principles that guided his life. Family loyalty and honest communication were cornerstones of Charles's personal philosophy, and the idea that his wife had violated both was devastating. Sir Edmund withdrew discreetly, leaving Charles alone to wrestle with the emotional and practical implications of what he had learned. The king found himself replaying recent conversations with both Camilla and searching for signs he might have missed. The careful neutrality of Camilla's responses when he had expressed frustration about the scheduling conflicts now seemed suspicious rather than diplomatic. The afternoon passed in a haze of conflicted emotions as Charles struggled to reconcile the evidence with his understanding of his wife. He considered the possibility of misunderstanding, hoping that there might be an explanation that would preserve the trust that had sustained their relationship. But The thoroughness of Sir Edmund's investigation left little room for alternative interpretations. Charles's immediate instinct was to confront Camilla directly, demanding an explanation for her actions. But his years of experience with delicate family situations counseled patience and careful consideration. A direct confrontation might lead to defensive reactions that would make understanding her motivations more difficult. He needed to approach this situation with the same careful diplomacy he brought to affairs of state. The king spent the remainder of the afternoon in his private study, declining all but the most urgent interruptions. His staff, sensing his need for solitude, rearranged his schedule to provide the space he required to process this personal crisis. The isolation gave him time to consider not just what Camilla had done, but why she might have felt compelled to take such drastic action. As evening approached, Charles found himself no closer to understanding his wife's motivations, but he had reached a decision about how to proceed. The situation required immediate resolution, both to repair his relationship with and to address the fundamental breach of trust that Camilla's actions represented. The conversation he needed to have with his wife would be one of the most difficult of their relationship. Camilla arrived home from her afternoon engagements to find Charles waiting in their private sitting room, his demeanor clearly indicating that something significant had occurred. She had spent the day attending charity functions and official meetings, but her mind had remained preoccupied with the deception she had orchestrated. The guilt and anxiety that had plagued her since Blocking's visit had grown stronger with each passing day. The queen consort immediately recognized the seriousness of Charles's mood. In their years together, she had learned to read the subtle indicators that marked his emotional state. The careful control he maintained in public sometimes gave way to more expressive communication in their private moments, and his current posture suggested news that would require careful handling. Charles's opening words confirmed her worst fears. He spoke quietly but directly, outlining Sir Edmund's investigation and the evidence that had led to the discovery of her interference. There was no accusation in his tone, no anger or recrimination, but the hurt in his voice was unmistakable. He simply stated the facts as they had been presented to him and asked for her explanation. Camilla's initial instinct was to deny the accusations, to suggest that there had been some mistake or misunderstanding. But the thoroughness of the evidence made such denials impossible, and her respect for Charles's intelligence made deception pointless. She had been caught in a betrayal that cut to the heart of their relationship, and only complete honesty offered any hope of repair. The explanation she offered was halting and emotional, revealing the insecurities and fears that had driven her to such desperate action. Camilla spoke of her concerns about Anne's influence on Charles, her worry that the Princess Royal's traditional approach might undermine the confidence he needed as a new monarch. She described her observations of the subtle tensions she believed she had detected and her fear that these might escalate into more serious conflicts. But even as she offered these explanations, Camilla recognized how inadequate they sounded when measured against the magnitude of her deception. Her fears about Anne's influence, however genuine, did not justify the systematic blocking of communication between Charles and his sister. The betrayal of trust her actions represented was far more damaging than any potential conflict she had sought to prevent. Charles listened to his wife's explanation with the careful attention he brought to all serious discussions, but his expression revealed the depth of his shock and disappointment. The woman he had trusted with the most intimate aspects of his life had deliberately interfered with one of his most important family relationships. The realization that she had been capable of such deception forced him to question other assumptions about their partnership. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of their relationship. Charles expressed his bewilderment at Camilla's actions and his hurt at her lack of trust in his judgment. He had always valued her counsel and support, but he had never imagined that this might lead her to take unilateral action that violated fundamental principles of honesty and respect. Camilla's response was filled with regret and self-recrimination. She acknowledged that her actions had been wrong and that they had stemmed from insecurities she had thought she had overcome. The years of criticism and public scrutiny had left deeper scars than she had realized, creating fears about her position and influence that had driven her to desperate measures. As the evening wore on, the couple struggled to find a way forward from this crisis of trust. Charles made it clear that Camilla's interference with his relationship with and was completely unacceptable and that such behavior could never be repeated. But he also recognized that her actions had been motivated by love and fear rather than malice, emotions that he could understand even as he condemned their expression. The immediate practical concern was how to repair the damage that had been done to Charles's relationship with Anne. The Princess Royal deserved to know why her attempts to meet with her brother had been frustrated, and she deserved an apology for the disrespect she had been shown. But the disclosure of Camilla's role in the situation would inevitably damage the already complex relationship between the two women. Charles insisted that Anne must be told the truth about what had happened, regardless of the consequences for family dynamics. His sister's trust and respect were too important to sacrifice for the sake of avoiding difficult conversations. The deception had already done damage to their relationship, and only complete honesty offered a hope of repairing that damage. Camilla accepted Charles's decision with resignation, understanding that the consequences of her actions would extend far beyond her relationship with her husband. Anne's opinion of her had always been important, both personally and professionally, and this betrayal would likely affect their ability to work together in the future. The royal family's public unity depended on private cooperation, and Camilla had seriously compromised that cooperation. The couple spent their final hours that evening in a state of emotional exhaustion, both recognizing that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the day's revelations. The trust that had sustained them through years of public criticism and personal challenges had been damaged in a way that would require considerable time and effort to repair. Charles retired that night with a heavy heart, contemplating the difficult conversations that lay ahead with both and the broader royal family. The revelation of Camilla's deception would inevitably become known to other family members and key staff, requiring careful management to prevent further damage to the monarchy's stability and public image. Camilla faced her own sleepless night, wrestling with the full implications of her actions and their consequences for everyone she cared about. Her attempt to protect Charles had instead caused him pain and damaged relationships that were crucial to his success as monarch. The irony was not lost on her that her efforts to strengthen his position had instead created vulnerabilities that might take years to overcome. The morning would bring the beginning of a healing process that would test the strength of both their marriage and the royal family's ability to weather personal crises while maintaining their public duties. The conversation with and loomed as the most immediate and potentially explosive challenge, but it was only the first step in addressing the broader implications of Camilla's unprecedented interference. As dawn broke over London, both Charles and Camilla faced the realization that their relationship had entered a new phase, one that would require rebuilding trust while navigating the complex demands of royal life. The love that had sustained them through previous challenges remained, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that even the strongest relationships could be tested by the unique pressures of their extraordinary circumstances. The meeting with Princess Anne was arranged for the following morning, taking place in the Oak Room at Clarence House, a setting that had witnessed countless important family discussions over the decades. Charles had chosen this venue deliberately, hoping that the formal yet intimate atmosphere would provide the appropriate context for what promised to be an extraordinarily difficult conversation, and arrived precisely on time, her punctuality reflecting the military precision that characterized all aspects of her royal duties. She entered the room with her characteristic bearing, confident and direct, but Charles immediately noticed the underlying tension in her posture. His sister had clearly sensed that something significant had prompted this urgent meeting, and her natural intelligence had likely led her to suspect that the recent scheduling difficulties were connected to whatever Charles needed to discuss. The Princess Royal took her customary seat across from Charles, declining the offer of tea or coffee with a polite but firm gesture that indicated her desire to address the matter at hand without the customary social preliminaries. Her blue eyes, so like their late mother's, fixed on Charles with an intensity that reminded him of childhood conversations where and had demanded straight answers to difficult questions. Charles began with an acknowledgement of the frustrations and had experienced in trying to arrange their meeting, offering an initial apology for the inconvenience without yet revealing the full scope of what had transpired. He watched his sister carefully, noting the slight narrowing of her eyes that indicated she suspected there was more to the story than simple administrative errors. Anne's response was characteristically direct. She had indeed been frustrated by the repeated delays, but more than that, she had been concerned about the unusual nature of the scheduling conflicts. Her experience with royal logistics was extensive, and the pattern of cancellations had struck her as highly irregular. She had begun to wonder if something was deliberately preventing their meeting. The confirmation of her suspicions, when it came, hit and with visible force. Charles explained the investigation that Sir Edmund had conducted and the evidence that had emerged pointing to Camilla's interference. He delivered the information with careful precision, outlining the facts without editorial comment, but the impact on and was immediate and profound. Princess Anne's initial reaction was stunned silence. Her usual quick responses temporarily suspended as she processed the magnitude of what Charles had revealed. The idea that Camilla would interfere with communication between royal family members was so unprecedented that, and struggled to find an appropriate framework for understanding it. Her years of royal service had taught her to expect many forms of palace intrigue, but not this particular variety. When and finally spoke, her voice carried a controlled anger that Charles had rarely heard from his diplomatic sister. She expressed her shock not just at Camilla's actions, but at the fundamental disrespect they represented, and had served the crown faithfully for decades, supporting Charles through his most difficult periods, and the idea that her loyalty would be rewarded with such treatment was deeply offensive to her sense of duty and family honor. Charles listened to his sister's response with growing anguish, recognizing that the damage Camilla had done extended far beyond the immediate scheduling conflicts. Anne's trust in the royal household's integrity had been shaken, and her confidence in the family's ability to function cohesively was seriously undermined. These were wounds that would heal slowly, if at all. The conversation that followed explored the broader implications of Camilla's actions for the royal family's internal dynamics, and raised concerns about precedent and the potential for similar interference in the future. If the queen consort felt entitled to block communication between family members based on her personal judgments, what other interventions might she consider justified? The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental trust issues that would need to be addressed. Anne's analysis of the situation was characteristically thorough and penetrating. She identified the various ways in which Camilla's interference could be interpreted by other family members, palace staff, and potentially the public if the story ever became known. Each interpretation carried risk for the monarchy's stability and effectiveness, creating vulnerabilities that would require careful management. The Princess Royal also raised questions about the underlying motivations that had driven Camilla to such extraordinary action. While she accepted Charles's explanation of his wife's insecurities and fears, and wondered whether these reflected deeper issues that might manifest in other ways. The royal family's effectiveness depended on trust and cooperation, and if Camilla felt unable to express her concerns through normal channels, the family's communication structures might need fundamental review. Charles found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending his wife's character while acknowledging the indefensibility of her actions. He explained his understanding of the pressures and insecurities that had influenced Camilla's decision, but he made clear that these factors did not excuse her behavior. The balance he sought to maintain between loyalty to his wife and justice for his sister required careful navigation. As the morning progressed, the conversation shifted from immediate reactions to practical considerations about how to move forward, and made it clear that she expected a personal apology from Camilla, delivered face-to-face and with complete acknowledgement of the wrongfulness of her actions. She also insisted that measures be put in place to prevent similar interference in the future, with clear consequences for any violations. The question of how much information about the incident should be shared with other family members proved particularly complex, and argued that transparency was essential for maintaining trust within the family, while Charles worried about the potential for the story to spread beyond family circles and damage the monarchy's public image. They ultimately agreed on a limited disclosure to senior family members, with a strict understanding about confidentiality. Anne's demands for accountability extended beyond Camilla to include the palace staff who had facilitated the interference. While she recognized that they had been following orders from someone they were obligated to obey, she insisted that clear guidelines be established to prevent future conflicts between loyalty to individuals and loyalty to the institution. The royal household's integrity depended on staff understanding their ultimate responsibility to the crown rather than to any single family member. The emotional toll of the conversation was evident on both siblings as they worked through the implications of Camilla's actions. Charles looked older than his years, the weight of managing this family crisis while fulfilling his duties as monarch clearly taking its toll, and maintained her composed exterior, but Charles could see the hurt and disappointment in her eyes as she contemplated the breakdown of trust within their family circle. Despite the pain of the revelations, the conversation also reinforced the deep bond between Charles and Anne. Their ability to discuss this crisis honestly and work toward solutions demonstrated the strength of their relationship and their shared commitment to the monarchy's welfare. Anne's anger was tempered by her love for her brother and her understanding of the difficult position Camilla's actions had placed him in. The immediate aftermath of the conversation required careful choreography to minimize further damage while beginning the healing process, and insisted on meeting with Camilla within days rather than allowing the situation to fester, recognizing that delay would only make an already difficult conversation more challenging. Charles agreed to arrange the meeting while also beginning the process of implementing the safeguards they had discussed. The conversation with Camilla that evening was one of the most difficult Charles had ever faced. He needed to communicate not just his own disappointment and hurt, but also Anne's reactions and demands. Camilla listened with evident distress as Charles described his sister's response, understanding for the first time the full scope of the damage her actions had caused. Camilla's agreement to meet with and came with visible reluctance, but she recognized that refusing would only compound the damage she had already done. She spent the following days preparing for what she knew would be one of the most humiliating experiences of her life, practicing apologies that could never fully address the magnitude of her betrayal of trust. The meeting between Camilla and took place 3 days later in Anne's private office at Buckingham Palace, a setting that emphasized the formal nature of the apology being offered, and had chosen the venue deliberately, wanting to receive Camilla's apology in surroundings that reflected the institutional gravity of what had transpired. Camilla arrived accompanied only by her personal private secretary, a minimal entourage that reflected both the personal nature of the meeting and her recognition that she was attending as a supplicant rather than as an equal. Her usual confident bearing was replaced by obvious nervousness, and she appeared to have aged visibly in the days since the truth had been revealed, and received Camilla with formal courtesy, but without warmth, offering the minimum social pleasantries before moving directly to the purpose of the meeting. The Princess Royal's demeanor made clear that this was not a social occasion, but a necessary piece of royal business that needed to be concluded efficiently and definitively. The apology Camilla offered was comprehensive and unqualified, acknowledging not just the wrongfulness of her actions, but the disrespect they had shown to and personally and to the institution they both served. She spoke of her regret and her understanding that her fears and insecurities had led her to violate fundamental principles of trust and honesty that sustained the royal family. Anne's acceptance of the apology was equally formal, acknowledging Camilla's contrition while making clear that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent demonstration of changed behavior. She outlined her expectations for future conduct and her understanding that any repetition of such interference would have serious consequences for Camilla's position within the family structure. The conversation that followed was brief and businesslike, covering practical arrangements for ensuring that similar incidents could not occur in the future, and insisted on direct access to Charles that could not be compromised by intermediaries, while also accepting Camilla's commitment to address her underlying insecurities through counseling and reflection. The weeks that followed tested every relationship within the royal family, as the implications of Camilla's actions continued to reverberate through the household. Staff members who had been involved in the deception faced difficult conversations about their loyalties and responsibilities, while family members struggled to restore confidence in their internal communications. Charles found himself in the challenging position of rebuilding his marriage while maintaining his relationship with and managing the broader family dynamics affected by the crisis. The process required careful attention to everyone's emotional needs while ensuring that the monarchy's essential functions continued without disruption. Camilla's journey back to acceptance within the family circle proved long and difficult, requiring not just apologies, but fundamental changes in her approach to royal relationships. She began working with a counselor to address the insecurities that had driven her to such desperate action, recognizing that her position required emotional stability that she had not previously achieved. The public remained unaware of the crisis that had shaken the royal family, but the internal changes were significant and lasting. New protocols were established to protect communication channels between family members, while also providing legitimate mechanisms for addressing concerns and conflicts before they escalated to damaging levels. Anne's relationship with both Charles and Camilla evolved in the aftermath of the crisis, becoming more formal but also more clearly defined. The trust that had been damaged was slowly rebuilt through consistent behavior and demonstrated commitment to the principles that sustained the royal family's effectiveness. The long-term impact of Camilla's interference extended beyond the immediate family to influence how the royal household operated and how conflicts were managed in the future. The incident became a case study in the importance of maintaining institutional integrity while respecting personal relationships, a balance that required constant attention and care. As months passed, the acute pain of the crisis faded, but the lessons learned remained influential in shaping how the royal family approached their internal relationships. Charles and Camilla's marriage survived the trauma, ultimately becoming stronger through the process of honestly confronting and addressing its vulnerabilities. Anne's forgiveness, when it finally came, was characteristically measured but genuine, reflecting her understanding that human weakness was forgivable when accompanied by genuine remorse and changed behavior. The Princess Royal's relationship with Camilla never returned to its previous state, but it evolved into something more honest and sustainable. The royal family's public face remained unchanged, but privately they had learned valuable lessons about the importance of communication, trust, and accountability in maintaining the relationships that sustained their extraordinary way of life. The crisis that had threatened to tear them apart ultimately taught them how to function more effectively as both a family and an institution dedicated to serving the crown and the people they represented.